Well, Samuel Ramani is a researcher at the University of Oxford, and he joins us now with some more analysis. Good to have you on the program with us. Do you think that this election holds any meaning other than just rubber stamping Assad's regime?
Well, I think it holds very little meaning. I think all it's going to do is rubber stamp Assad for another 7 years in power. It's important to keep in mind that there were 51 candidates who potentially put themselves forward, and there's only three people running. And the fact that the franchise is really only confined to the Assad-held areas of Syria, and that excludes Idlib, and that excludes opposition strongholds, and refugees, depending on where they live. In some countries like France and Turkey are barred entirely. Elsewhere, they have a nominal right to vote, but in practice, that's not really being exercised. So I really don't think that there's anything democratic about these elections at all.
Yeah, tell us more about how the outside world is viewing this election, especially Syrians who have fled their home country and aren't even eligible to vote, given those stringent eligibility requirements that Yasin told us about.
So the international community's response is obviously bifurcated on the grounds of whether you support or oppose Assad. So Assad's leading opponents in the West, the United States, Britain, and the European Union, have already prematurely said that this election is going to be a sham. Whereas Assad supporters, Russia, China, Iran, have sent election observers to Syria and are most likely going to validate the elections as legitimate. So that's the international response. With regards to the Syrian diaspora response, the Syrian opposition members who live abroad are aggrieved by the fact that Idlib and those areas are excluded from franchise, and also the 10-year residency requirement for running for president, which meant that anybody who left Syria during the war is considered to be a lesser citizen to those who stayed and supported Assad, is something that's really, really rankling the Syrian opposition. Not that they can exert that much leverage to change the situation, though.
For people who oppose the regime with Assad's all but certain win, is there any hope of their country ever emerging from Assad's reign and the civil war it's found itself in for the last 10 years?
Unfortunately, the situation is very pessimistic right now. The economic situation is in almost catastrophic. There's been a 97% decline in the value of the Syrian pound. There's more than 80% of Syrians live in poverty. And Assad's rule for another 7 years would basically prevent any new reconstruction investments from coming in because the U.S. Caesar Act sanctions will almost certainly remain in effect, deterring even countries that would be willing to invest in Syria, like China, Russia, UAE, Iran, from shelling out money. So I think that the prospects for a peaceful and prosperous Syria right now are sadly looking very, very remote.
The UN has called for a new constitution and transitional government. Do you have any hope at all that Assad has the intention of living up to what's been promised?
Well, if Assad had any intention of living up to those promises, he would have followed the what the UN was suggesting, what the international community in the West, in particular, mostly wanted, which was to deal with the Constitution first, and then have elections that could be held in an equitable and free way. By going ahead with the elections and by deliberately obfuscating and stalling the constitutional talks that were held earlier this year, Assad clearly showed that he's only interested in the constitutional talks to make himself look good and to rubber stamp his own authority, and he really isn't interested in changing the nature of Syrian politics. So I think that if Assad stays and he gets more recognition from Arab League countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and he returns to the Arab League, the chances of a constitutional negotiation that's anywhere near equitable or more democratic becomes even lower.
All right, we'll leave it there. Samuel Ramani joining us from Oxford. Thank you.